My research question is, do we have more control over our happiness than is out of our control? Initially, I thought I was going to go more the nature versus nurture route. So, in the preliminary research, I Google searched, are some people born happier than others? And the articles that were coming up weren't really relevant, but they were a bunch of research articles. So, I started looking through the references list, and this guy, Ed Diener, kept coming up. So, I decided to search E. Diener Personality SWB, which stands for Subjective Wellbeing, in Google Scholar, and my first source is one of the things that came up. It is a research article done in 1990 by William Pavitt, Ed Diener, and Frank Fujita, published in Personality and Individual Differences. And their research aimed to find and then explain a correlation between the extroversion personality trait and subjective well-being. And they found that personality does affect subjective well-being because it was found that extroverts have higher levels of positive affect than introverts when they are alone, as well as when they are in their most comfortable element, which is surrounded by people. So this addresses what I may end up arguing against in the final paper. It addresses my opposition, and it caused me to change my research question because now I see that personality does have some role. So it might be important to note the age of this source. It was published in 1990, which is when happiness and well-being was just starting to be studied scientifically. And personality was one of the first theories of happiness, so that's something to keep in mind when looking at this source in comparison to the other ones. So from this source, I searched extroversion and happiness, Ed Diener, into the VCU library database, and this article is one of the things that came up. It's a research article published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2002. It's by Pierce Steele and Dennis Wuns. It looks at a bunch of factors, including extroversion and some other things such as the tendency to lie and their influence on well-being. And the whole thing is pretty long. It's filled with a bunch of solid research, but the main point that I want to take away from it is that while extroversion does influence subjective well-being, its influence is greater on a larger, and in this article's case, on a national scale, because the sociability facet of extroversion benefits introverts as well, not just the extroverts. So, and I believe that's explained right over here. So, that kind of pokes a hole in the argument for personality being the main or the biggest influence on happiness because it takes away from its reliability. So this will help me combat the argument presented in the previous source, as well as the argument for personality being the sole contributor to happiness in general. So my next source came from, or was influenced by this slide, which is slide from a lecture in a class that I'm in this semester called The Science of Happiness. When I saw this, it kind of got me thinking that, hey, this whole thing is in our control, almost half of it. So I typed this into Google, and this article is one of the sources that came up. It's a research review done by Sonia Lubomirsky, Kenan Sheldon, and David Schade. It was published in the Review of General Psychology in 2005. So they argue that our general level of happiness is determined by a combination of our genetically determined happiness set point, intentional activities, and mood-relevant circumstantial factors. So the review of research was done, and it was concluded that intentional actions have the most influence over our chronic happiness level. And it kind of asks the same questions that I've been asking, such as, is it possible to become happier since genes do play a role in our happiness? And how could we make ourselves happier? So in the same search, this source also came up. It is a research review as well, done by Julia Baum and Sonia Lubomirsky, and some of their own research is included in here too, in comparison with the research that they're reviewing. And so this, in the beginning, it addresses the issue that no long-term studies have been conducted on this yet, or as of 2007, there were no long-term studies available to them. So the studies had only lasted 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. So they address that as an issue. But it uses the sustainable happiness model that was introduced in the previous source to more specifically outline the pieces of happiness and review research that tested those pieces' effect on happiness over varying lengths of time. So this article concludes that less happy people can in fact become lastingly happier through intentional, effortful, happiness enhancing strategies and by being committed to make a conscious effort and make these activities a part of their daily lives. So this answers my main research question as well as one of my sub questions, which is can unhappy people become happier? So through studies in this review, it's shown that doing acts of kindness, expressing gratitude, and other intentional activities can and will increase overall subjective well-being. They acknowledge that more research is needed to figure out which of those activities works best and under what conditions they are most effective, but it's still shown that it does work. So, my next source I found on our library research day. I went to the psychology research guide. I clicked on psych info as the database, and then I just typed in happiness and then clicked index term happiness, and this article is one that came up. So it is a research article published in the Journal of Psychology of Violence in 2016, and it was done by these 7 people. They're all from pretty well-known schools with a strong presence of research, and Penn State is one to actually pay pretty close attention to because they are the first school to have a positive psychology program. So the research that comes out of there is very reliable. It's very widely respected and known in the scientific world, so that's important to pay attention to. So this contributes a sense of importance to my research question by showing just how our well-being affects nearly all the other aspects of our lives, and this lists all the 7 reasons that we need to invest in our well-being, and it goes into great detail on each of them. So the first one is well-being is a natural motivator. This basically just means that people who successfully pursue higher levels of happiness through one means, such as maybe exercise, will be more motivated to continue to look for better ways to keep that momentum going. Another thing is that it improves physical health and longevity. So this means that the social support that you get when you go into new endeavors may help people to seek preventative health care. So I think it talks about getting a mammogram or a prostate exam. So so just the social support that comes from this may have completely unrelated good effects. Another one is that well-being is good for the economy. This one I feel like a lot of people kind of know about. When you're happy, you tend to make more productive work. Your quality of work tends to be better. So that can just lead to economic success for you, for your company, and for like our economy as a whole. It goes on through all the other ones, promotes positive relationship, catalyzes the success of other interventions, and it may elicit a population level shift in mental health. So basically, this just illustrates why well-being is so important and why my audience should care about what I will be telling them about. So my next source I got from a book that was required for me to read in my Science of Happiness course. The book was by Martin Seligman, so I searched Seligman well-being in Google Scholar, and this is one thing that came up. So it is a research report from 2002, published in a journal called Psychological Science, written by Seligman and Ed Diener, both of whom who have already been introduced. They're very, very respected, very well known in the positive psychology world and the happiness and well-being world as well. So in abstract, it kind of tells you what this is all about. A large sample of college undergraduates were given happiness level screening, and the results and factors between those with high and those with low scores were compared. And what's interesting is that in most other research, when they talk about intentional activities as being contributors to happiness, it almost always includes one or all of the following: religious affiliation, socialization, and or exercise as being the most or extremely important. But in this study, they found that those with high and those with low scores showed no more or less activity in any of those areas except for socialization. So socialization was the only thing that was necessary to obtain a high happiness score in this research. So the case for intentional activities is still being made, even if it does disagree on other sources or other research on what intentional activities are important. It's still being acknowledged that they are important. My next source was found in the same search that one was found in. It's a book by Martin Seligman called Flourish, and it was published in 2011. One of the most famous quotes that came out of this book was, "Strong biological underpinnings predispose some of us to sadness, anxiety, and anger, but those can only be ameliorated, not wholly eliminated. So this aids in the argument that we have more control over our happiness than anything else, because even though those predispositions such as personality do exist, they don't have to be determinate." This also talks about how well-being is a construct. It's not defined by any one element, but instead by contributions of each of these elements. So it's a moderator of the argument between personality versus conscious control, but it still shows that the things that we do play huge roles despite our predispositions. This also addresses one of my other sub-questions, which is whether we can change our happiness levels for the long term, and it does this through something called the What Went Well exercise. So basically, you write down or tell someone 3 things that went well, and it boosts your happiness, boosts your well-being. And this shows that it lasted for 6 months. And also, it does tell you later in the book that they tested it at a year as well as 18 months, and those people who stuck to this exercise still had higher levels of happiness. So this is one of the first things that studied intentional activities and happiness on a more long-term basis. So my last source is actually the book that was required of me in my Science of Happiness class, called Well-Being: The 5 Essential Elements by Tom Rath and Jim Harker. It was published in 2010. And one study in the book that I found of particular relevance was a study done by Gallup, and it included over 150 countries, so it was a massive study, and it asked hundreds of satisfaction-related questions about a variety of areas and compared answers with people's daily experiences and their overall life evaluation. And at the end, during statistical analyses, 5 distinct factors emerged, which are the 5 essential elements of well-being, which are these. So career well-being, social well-being, financial well-being, physical well-being, and community well-being. So all 5 of these things describe things that we can do something about. They're important to people in every situation that was studied, so this shows that the findings are generalizable across cultures, and they're all very much within our control. So now I'll talk about a couple of the sources that I decided not to use. One of them was an interview. I chose not to use this simply because I figured it wouldn't be of much help. I would probably only be directed towards more research, which I may come across later, or maybe I've already come across. I figured it just wouldn't really do much for me. And another source I decided not to use is Personality, Culture, and Subjective Well-Being. This focused on culture, like your location, collectivistic versus individualistic, in terms of well-being, and I thought that just opened the door way too wide. My scope of research is not large enough to need to include something like this, so I decided to go ahead and throw this out as well. And here is my references.